Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Retro Renaissance Podcast. I'm your host, as usual, Austin Newton, and today I'm just going to do a little monologue about one of the topics I mentioned in the introductory episode. So, the loneliness pandemic. It's something that has been a growing issue in not only our country, but in other countries as well, since about the 1960s, 70s, somewhere in there. And the terrifying aspect of it is that the generation of young people, so you might say like the millennials or even some of the Gen Xers and on up to the Gen Z kids, are feeling the most adverse effects of this. And why is it kind of terrifying? Well, it's because these are the people that will be filling many of the roles of the next generation. And we could actually spend a whole episode just talking about the decline in birth rates and the fact that there aren't as many young people to fill those positions now as compared to the old people, the boomers and that sort of thing that are leaving those jobs open. But I wanted to talk about the loneliness pandemic, and many of you who like to listen to these types of, social and cultural issues have probably heard about it before. But I wanted to kind of look at it from the perspective of a more traditional lifestyle and how we can maybe try to rebuild those connections as, not only individuals, but as societies to fight this pandemic, or I guess better said, an epidemic of loneliness and the general sense of dissatisfaction that we're having as a whole. So let's talk about what loneliness is just from a more primal perspective. Evolutionarily speaking, you can kind of think of loneliness as a defense mechanism. Like a lot of our primal instincts, we have them because they keep us safe. They keep us away from danger. And loneliness is certainly one of those. And the way that you can think about it is if you're an individual in, the times of, somewhere between 10 and, 200,000 years ago, something like that, and you're on your own in the desert or in the plains of Africa or something like that, and there's tigers and there's lions and there's hyenas, or maybe there's coyotes, or there's different things that are coming after you. Being alone is not necessarily a great place to be, because in that situation, if something comes up and decides to attack you, well, you're left to your own devices. What spears and bows and like little handmade stone knives are going to help you. And so, like with a lot of our instincts, you might ask the question, well, if loneliness is to prevent us from being in this state of danger, then how does it manifest? What does it teach us? What does it tell us to do? Well, being that Homo sapiens are quite social in nature, when we feel lonely, the natural instinct is to find another person, or to find more than one person, to find maybe a tribe of people. And so that's what we did. We clumped together into tribes, and then we built societies and so on and so forth. And it was just a protection mechanism at the time. But later on, it became imperative to its own survival, that being the society as a whole, in the sense that, first you have these farmers, and these farmers start to produce things that other people will want to have. And so instead of going out and trying to hunt for them or gather for them, you can have this one person in your tribe or a few people in your tribe that manage this farm, and you can buy things from them, and then you can sell things, and then you can, start having regulations about how to sell and buy these things. And the next thing you know, you have something similar to a modern society. And so loneliness kind of fights against the issues that would put those in danger. Fast forward to modern times, and the loneliness epidemic really starts to reveal itself around the 1960s or 70s, somewhere in there. There was a research article published in 2023. It was by a researcher by the name of Alan Greenblatt, and it was focused on the loneliness epidemic, specifically in more modern years, looking at how COVID sort of exacerbated the situation, but then talked about where it came from and how it manifested originally, and how it's been sort of a slow burn kind of issue and not a just right here on a doorstep, as even though that's what a lot of people will say, or that's kind of what it seems like based on a lot of the traditional articles and conversations that are had about it. And anyway, in this research piece, Allen states that the mass social movements of the 1960s helped shift people's attention from local concerns to more national issues. So let's think about what that means. In the 1960s, you're having the civil rights movement, and you're having protests about, equality and the sexual revolution and that sort of thing. And so people are sort of coming together to make their voices heard on these, gargantuan problems that they thought affected our society as a whole, and was trying to fight against them, essentially. Now, you might say that shouldn't that in and of itself promote conversation, and shouldn't it promote gatherings with other people and just these general situations that are or have more of a proclivity to induce the types of things that we as social creatures need and feel we should have to fight loneliness? And while it might seem that way on the surface, you have to realize that the focus was not on, let me go and talk to my brethren over here about what it is that they say, my comrades, or this, that, and the other, and let me have these social interactions with them. It was more about, we're all here for one particular reason, and we're here to fight, insert here, global issues or race issues or whatever. And the decade afterwards, in the 1970s, was when we started to see the me decade, right? The me movement, where issues were no longer about the large scale. It was more about the small scale. Divorce rates were getting higher, so there was a lot more single mothers, and they were more concerned with how they were going to raise their kids without a father. You started to see some inflation in the housing market, so couples started to worry about how can we buy a house for ourselves, and not how can we build nice, safe neighborhoods and communities for the others that we have. And so we started to look more for our own individual desires and problems, and less about that of our brethren in society, our direct neighbors or people that we knew in the communities that we would stop and talk to at the grocery store or at the gas stations or what have you. And there's a really nice quote from Robin Williams in a series that went on from, I think, like 1978 to 1982. So it was right around the later half of the first onset of that loneliness epidemic. And in the show, he says, loneliness is a disease of the spirit. And by the way, the show is Mork and Mindy, if you guys are interested. It's the one where he wears the big red suit with the silver thing on it. As I was saying, he says that loneliness is a disease of the spirit. And people who have it think that no one cares about them. People make themselves lonely. They're so busy looking out for number one that they don't have room for two. And I think this really well paints the picture, not only in terms of what we're seeing today, but what was being seen at the time. Because I feel like in art and in movies and in all of these types of things, we tend to exemplify what we notice at the time. Right? It's kind of like a good example of this is if you're watching movies that are like really old, you'll notice the way that men and women interact with each other is completely different than the way they do in movies today. And part of that just kind of has to go along with the culture of that time. They spoke differently. The types of phraseology that they used was different. You will notice that the etiquettes that they had when they would sit down to eat or when they would enter a home or that sort of thing were completely different. You'll notice that the hairstyles are different, the clothes are different. And all of those are just exemplary of the fact that Hollywood, I guess you would want to say, or the record companies or whatever, tend to put out what is more prominent at that time. And so by Robin Williams stating that in the show and in the other movies that are kind of talking about this around the time, you're starting to see how people are noticing, not just the everyday mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters that are, trying to go out and live their own daily lives, but also from the, high executives in LA or in New York or whatever. They're starting to see these types of issues and commenting on them in their own pieces. I think another good example of that is if you look at these old videos of students in high school throughout time. There was one that I saw, I think it was back in August or September of last year. That was really nice. And it started with like the 1930s and then worked its way on up to the modern days in 1990s and 2000s and so on and so forth. And I was showing them to my students just to kind of give them an idea of how we as educators and we as, people who are involved in the policy making of education have changed over the years. And that's a whole nother conversation that I'll get into with another episode of the Retro Renaissance podcast. But it also shows just the way that students interacted with each other at the time. Just kind of going off on a little aside here, when I was a substitute teacher, this is before I got my official licensure, so I was, kind of doing this to make a little bit of part-time money while I was, doing my degree. I was a substitute educator at the high school that I went to, which was kind of interesting. And they had changed some teachers out, so there was new faces and new names for me to know. But I was substitute teaching there, and I happened to have a conversation with a teacher that was talking about the fact that, high schools have changed so much. When we were in high school, you would see kids, out in the hallway, like pushing each other around, talking to each other and telling jokes and like this, that, and the other. And, oh, did you see Sarah and Ben again? All this stuff, spreading gossip and what have you. But they were always socializing with each other. And granted, this was around the time of the pandemic. So kids were still kind of a little bit, I guess, weary of each other, and maybe they had a couple of years off, and they also got held back, and so their friends were new friend groups and that sort of thing, and so maybe there was a little bit of anxiety socially there. But even before the pandemic, there was this issue of whenever you would see students, they would just be sitting on their phones. They would pull them out, go scroll through Facebook, Instagram, that sort of thing. And even though they're in an area where there are other people around, they're not having conversations with them in real time. And I can remember an example of this even when I was in school, like, which we just kind of did it because we thought it was funny or like that. It was just a different way to do things. But we would be sitting right next to each other and texting each other something back and forth and having a conversation virtually instead of just opening our mouths and being verbal about it. So the reason I was showing my students these videos was to show them that, like, hey, it wasn't always this way. And you guys actually used to talk to each other and play pranks and do this, that, and the other. And, even though it was really hard for teachers, I would assume, to deal with, airplanes throwing back and forth. And, I used to have friends that would make random sounds in the middle of class just to get attention. Like, they wanted to have interactions with their peers. And now, if you do want to have an interaction with your peer, it's cooler to just go on Facebook or to go on Instagram or post a TikTok or that sort of thing. And even older adults are doing this. And I have an uncle that's on his phone all the time, just going through Facebook and this, that, and the other. Which brings me to another, part of the issue, which is technology. Now, not all countries and cultures believe that technology has a prominent role to play in this problem. Japan, I think, was polled at one time, and only 26% of their population said that they thought that technology had anything to do with the loneliness pandemic, specifically social media. But, social media has really done a lot, not only for the loneliness issue, but just for our mental health and physical health in general. And before I get into that, I just want to mention on the subject of physical health, when the Surgeon General in 2017 was issuing a statement about the loneliness pandemic, there was a study that had come out by one Julianne Holt-Lundstedt, who is a psychologist and a neuroscience expert at Birmingham Young University. Did a study which looked at the physiological effects of loneliness. And you hear things like, every cigarette that you smoke takes 20 minutes off your life, or every alcoholic beverage that you drink takes off so much of your life, or that sort of thing. So it decreases your likelihood of living to at least the average life expectancy. And you can kind of calculate a rate for that. And the study that was done by Julianne noticed that loneliness can be as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it has an actual profound physical effect on your body and the likelihood that you're going to live to a certain age. And it also has mental effects, as the Surgeon General pointed out, because one of the things they noticed was that it causes an uptick in depression. It causes an uptick in anxiety. And so there's real health issues associated with loneliness. And it's not just like I feel bad type of thing. But when it comes to social media, that's sort of furthered those feelings of depression and anxiety, because what happens is, and I have family members that do this all the time, and I have friends that do this, and you probably do too. They'll post something on Facebook. They'll say, me and the family went to New York over the break and did this and ate this expensive restaurant, yada, 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 and they post all these pictures and stuff. And there's a quote that says something to the effect that comparison is the thief of joy. And that's exactly what it is you start to compare yourself to what those other people are doing, and it makes you feel worse. It makes you feel more lonely. It makes you feel more inadequate, or like, oh, I'm not doing enough in my life. And in some weird way, it's making us want to just stay in more. And so even though social media was originally designed so that you could have interactions with people that, weren't physically in the same space as you, you could have friends that were in another state, in another country, and sit down and be able to, like Facebook Live, or you could sit down and you could chat, or you could leave comments and that sort of thing, share videos. Even though that was the intended purpose, it's got completely warped now to the point where it's only making matters worse. And it's also making people not want to approach each other, because we have this tendency to make ourselves look perfect all the time. And, people get on Instagram and they'll post pictures and they'll do a lot of touch-ups. They'll do a lot of Photoshop to make themselves look better. And then we come and look at it as like the average Joe, and we see that and we think, oh, I'm not adequate enough. And I can't be going out and having, relationships with these types of people and trying to date these types of people, or trying to have conversations with these types of people, because they're so above and beyond what I am. When at the end of the day, these people are just, organic, real, natural people. And I love this trend that's been going around of people posting 2 pictures on their Instagram, which is the one that's been like the retouched version, or the one that's like them sucking it in. And there's the other one of them just standing there, and they are, at their natural self. And you can kind of see a little belly pooch or whatever it is. And makes us feel a little bit better. And I think that's kind of an important thing to see, as the reality of the situation. So social media, in the sense that it's designed these more fake and arbitrary lifestyles, has been detrimental as well. And I think it would be nice to see a movement towards, a heightened sense of realism. If we don't get rid of social media altogether, which I don't think is going to happen, at least to be more realistic about who we are, which requires us to be open, and it requires us to be honest, and to be a little bit, I guess, more, for lack of a better term, putting our necks out there. But anyway, to talk a little bit more about just how large this epidemic is. There was a national 2019 survey done by Cigna, which was a health insurance provider, which found that 61% of Americans reported feeling lonely, which is quite terrifying in and of itself. And there was another poll, I think, done in the United Kingdom that found like 33 or 31% of people said that they didn't even know how to make friends, which is another issue in and of itself, because people are afraid to go and talk to people, and they don't know what to say, and they don't know how to do things that will foster relationships. And it's really kind of interesting that in Japan, whereas their solution to this problem is, completely contrasted by ours, but they have a market of people that you can kind of rent as, fake friends or fake family members or whatever. I guess you could use them at social functions, but also just to go and have coffee with, or to take a walk with, or that sort of thing. And you can hire them and just have a conversation with them. This is a completely stranger. And then, of course, at the end of the day, they'll take their money, they'll leave, and that sort of thing. And you kind of end up in the same situation that you did before. But at least they are promoting conversations with actual people. When you look at the way that, our country has decided to combat the loneliness pandemic, there's a company that is designing a AI. I guess it's like an application where you can design, say, a man or a woman to be one of several templates. So maybe you want them to be goth, maybe you want them to be preppy, maybe you want them to be more traditional, or more, whatever. You can kind of like design their personalities, and you can talk to them. There's also some detrimental effects of this towards relationships, because one of the things that it does is, if you're having a conversation with this thing, which is absolutely not a human, by the way, no matter how much it might seem to be, even if it were to pass the Turing test, it's still not human. You can interject a certain level of intimacy into the conversation. You can flirt with them, and they'll flirt back. You can even get to the point where you guys have agreed on becoming partners, like a relationship. And it's kind of scary that we as a civilization have utilized AI to this level, which I feel like is just going to be another rendition of social media. It's just going to add to the loneliness pandemic, because at the end of the day, you turn that application off, and where are you? You're still by yourself. So I guess you could give props to some Eastern cultures for at least enlisting people to try to fight this thing. But I think that there's something to be said for a return to more traditional types of homes and relationships and communities to try to combat this issue. And what I mean by that is, if you think about homes in the 1940s and 1950s and communities before a lot of these types of things started happening, before there was this recognition of national issues and going out and protesting against them and all that sort of thing, which, don't get me wrong, there were benefits to doing that because it helped to change a lot of policy and a lot of legislation in our society. But in the traditional home, you sort of had these small communities of people. And parents would raise their kids, and they would go and play with the kids up the street, and they would all get together for play dates, and they would get to know each other, and families would go out on picnics and like congregate with each other, and kids would have their friends. And there was no technology, obviously, except for maybe a TV or a radio or that sort of thing. And kids didn't have phones in their hands and doing Facebook and Instagram by the time they were like 3 years old and getting swept up in all of that toxic stuff that goes on. But it was like, if you went out of the house, you go and you'd meet somebody at the grocery store that was an old friend or something, you get to talk to them. Or like there's these really nice old videos that just sort of kind of show how people used to congregate in, like, say, in France or in Germany, these sort of things, pre-war, where they'd be sitting at cafes and just talking to each other. You would go up and you meet strangers and you just say hi and this, that, and the other, and you'd start to have a conversation. And it was very much normal to do this. It was like ping-ponging around and bouncing off as many ideas with people as you do bouncing off people themselves. And it was quite a normal thing to do. And that's one of the reasons why my significant other and I advocate for going back to some of these more traditional values and trying to create communities that are like that, where there's not as much technology and there's more social interaction, and actually raising your kids to understand the etiquette that you need to be able to have conversations with different types of people, which I feel like is another issue, because parents are not raising their kids. They're letting the technology do it. They're letting the nannies do it. They're letting different people. And I get that we all have busy lives and we all have things that we need to do. And we're in an economy now where if there's two parents in a household, both of them have to work to be able to make things, occur, to make ends meet or what have you. And I get that. But, like I was talking to my significant other about this, and I was like, well, I kind of want to raise our children in an environment where, if they want to be stimulated by something, like instead of going on social media or playing video games or something, maybe they have like a model car, or maybe they have some Barbies in a Barbie doll house, or maybe they get together with their friends and they go out and play in a sandbox, or they go, like when I grew up, I would go exploring in the woods because I grew up in an area that was very rural. So you got there and climb trees and that sort of thing. And you go climb barns like I did with my cousin. We would play sword fight and that sort of stuff. And just sort of building these communities where we can raise our kids together and raise them to be social, and kind of like, instead of using games and social media and that sort of thing, we give them toys and we give them interactive puzzles and we give them these different types of things to kind of like not only help to prop up their education, but to make them more social. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that we no longer, as a society of parents, do that with our kids anymore. So that's something that I want to do. And also just to have like time for each other. And it's really hard to do in an age where it's all stop and go. It's all, I need to be here and I need to be there. And in 5 minutes, I've got this meeting, and then I've got to take a phone call, and then I've got to do these data sheets and all this stuff. And then by the time I come home, I've just got enough time to lay down and relax, and I'm exhausted and I don't want to talk to anybody. And that's really hard to do, especially in households where there's, two people working at the same time. And that's why my significant other and I are big advocates here on the Retro Renaissance podcast of going back to these traditional like gender roles and household roles, and like, you have somebody that stays behind and helps to raise the children up to a certain age and helps to take care of the cooking and the cleaning and this, that, and the other, while somebody else does a lot of the work, is because anybody who's ever lived on their own knows that it feels like you're living with two sets of responsibilities in your life, right? Just coming from a practical matter, like when I get home, I have to do dishes, I have to do the laundry, I have to clean, I have to do this and the other, all while I have to make sure that I'm meeting my requirements at my job, and I have to make sure that I plan it. I have to make sure that I'm filing out this form, and I'm sending in this thing, and I'm showing up for work for every day, and like, while all these things at home are just like getting piled up into to the point where they become a giant avalanche of things to do. And like something as simple as bringing in groceries feels like it's very difficult to do, and when you don't have the energy to do it. And it'd be really nice if you just had someone to help with those types of things. If there were two people in the household that had separate roles, it just makes your life so much easier. And I think there's something to be said for those institutions and why they were there in the first place, just from our practical matter. So I think going off of that having more traditional relationships is very important for fighting the loneliness pandemic. While it may not seem to be entirely related, there is a war waging between men and women. It's been going on for quite a long time, especially since about the second or third wave of the sexual revolution, where women now have, regardless of what they feel they're getting in their day-to-day lives, they have a tremendous amount of power, especially over relationships. In the judicial system, who gets usually the custody of the kids in a divorce, or the house or the car or whatever it is. Most of the time it goes to the female. And what's really scary is that in about 30 different states, if you're a woman, you can go to a civil court and file a claim against it doesn't even have to be the husband, it could be your boyfriend or whoever. And so long as you've spent time at his place, so long as you've been there, thrown some bags around. Now, the specific criteria is different from state to state, but let's say that you live with them for a little while, or you see them on weekends or something like that, but you have some connection to their home. You have some ground to stand on to say that we're in some sort of relationship. You can go to a civil court as a female, and you can make a claim against this man that he's been domestically abusing you, that he's been abusing, your kids, or that he's been, whatever. And without an investigation, without warning, they can come and take his house, take his car, take everything away from him. And it's given rise to movements like MGTOW, which I talked about again in the introduction, where men are saying the only way that I can prevent this kind of thing from happening in my life is just to avoid women altogether. So then men are trying to avoid women. Women are trying to avoid men because they have been told that, the most important thing for you needs to be your career. The most important thing needs to be climbing up the ladder. And it needs to be, being on your own and learning who you are and doing all these things on your own and being a boss babe. And as we've seen with generations of that who have gotten older and have lived through that, it just leads to more loneliness. Right? I was talking about this with my significant other the other day, and one of the reasons that we're so glad that we found each other is because, we can start a lifelong journey together, and we can raise a family, and we can have kids, and we can have, extensions with grandkids and this, that, and the other. And it's not as lonely, because living on your own does have certain benefits, but there's also drawbacks, which we're seeing with the loneliness pandemic. And when we're in a society where women feel like they can't talk to men because they might get raped, or men don't want to talk to women because they're afraid they might get everything that they own taken away from them, where is that putting us? There was a time when our society, and especially our government, advocated for families. Right? You got certain benefits if you had kids, if you had marriage, if you got together, if you bought a house, if this, that, and the other. If you tried to start something together, it was more beneficial to do so than to be alone. And I think that's part of the issue. And we've gotten so far away from traditional values and norms and the types of social structures that we used to have. There's a article that's published by Gina Gustafsson from, I believe, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but it's from Uppsala University. And she says in one of her research articles that society is undergoing the slow but steady weakening of shared collective identities, norms, and cultures. And I think that's aptly said. And part of the thing that's risen up by us being more individualized and looking at me and looking at my problems is we started to question things about ourselves that we never did. We started to question the sexual identities and gender identities of toddlers. We started to question whether or not we were cats or dogs or helicopters or whatever it is. And so to try to make it seem like that's okay, we've put up these new norms and new values and new cultures around them that has made it difficult for us to have the traditional relationships, which kept us from being lonely. And Jordan Peterson and some other people that have done a lot of extensive research on this have talked about that there was a really good interview between Jordan Peterson and a lady who was one of these boss babes that, was in her 30s and was talking about how satisfying her life had been just focusing on her career. And he was like, well, it starts to get really lonely by the time you reach 45 and you don't have a family, you don't have kids and this, that, and the other. And these are just things that I've started to notice as I got older. And I started to spend, year after year, started a passive me living alone. I mean, yeah, you can get pets and you can have, friends and this, that, and the other, but it's just not the same as the type of emotional bond and physical intimacy and just sense of fulfillment that you get with being with someone else. And so here on the Retro Renaissance podcast, what we want to do is we want to foster those types of values. Is we want to give people who feel like that's missing in their lives a place to come and they can talk about these issues and they can, sort of like share tips and tricks on how they did things and this, that, and the other. And I just want to say that I think, again, starting to raise our children in communities where it's more about the socialization than it is about video games, than it is about technology is a great thing. I think focusing on having more traditional relationships and focusing on having roles within the household is a great thing. And I think having just communities at large where everybody in that community goes by those same types of narratives and those types of norms is really important. Which really kind of brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about here on this episode, which is communities that have more traditional values, which we often kind of overlook. And it's sad because they're quite successful in the sense of how well they foster socialization and a sense of togetherness, which is Amish communities. Where I grew up, as I said before, was quite rural. And it wasn't uncommon to get on these little narrow one-lane roads and end up behind an Amish buggy wagon sort of thing, where they have the horse and some of them are open, some of them are covered. Typically, they would rotate those out based on season, but, every once in a while, again, you'd see a completely open wagon in the winter, and, the women would have these big blankets on them, then the men would have their hats and all that sort of stuff, trying to stay warm. But I have some family who, I guess for a very long time, have been really close friends with some of the Amish community. They've come out to build houses for several of my cousins, and they've also been enlisted to build businesses within the community. It's a small town. I think they just recently put a Taco Bell there, and they enlisted the use of Amish hands to build it with. So they're kind of deeply ingrained in that area, and they've expanded quite a bit. You see a lot more homes and farms and that sort of thing. And what's really interesting about the Amish communities is, say what you want about their technology usage. Yeah, maybe they don't use electrical systems. Maybe they don't have traditional lighting, or maybe they don't have vehicles that they drive around, or maybe they don't have a lot of electric appliances that they use in the kitchen or what have you. But one thing that can't be, I guess, said enough or overstated about the Amish is that they have a really tight community and a deep sense of it's not about any one individual person, but it's about everyone. And when it comes to living in a more, I guess, retro lifestyle or a more traditional lifestyle, look no further in modern times than Amish communities. Because let's say there's a storm that rolls through and your house gets blown down, or, maybe lightning strikes a tree and it hits the roof or something like that. You never have to worry about what's going to happen to your family or your home because your community is going to rally behind you. And you don't get that same sense of loneliness because that's, well, we're going to come together. We're going to get our saws and we're going to get our hammers out and we're going to go up there and we're going to fix those shingles and we're going to make it better again. Or if one of your family members gets sick, the community is going to rally together behind you. Or if there's someone else in the community, and they need help, that you're going to trade off your time and services to help them. And it's all on a volunteer basis. And, they help to raise each other's children. And they teach each other's children these core values that's going to make them happier later in life. One of the other things that my significant other and I have talked about when it comes to raising children is the need for them to understand that you're going to grow up and you're going to have a family. And one day you're going to get married and you're going to have your own kids. And it's not to say that you won't have kids that take alternative routes. I mean, certainly that's been the case for the last couple of generations, is this sense of, well, it doesn't really matter if I have a family or not because I can do things on my own. Again, it's all about the age of me. It's about the individualist point of view. But I think being taught that from a young age and coming to understand that not only is it okay, but it's almost like it's expected of you to do that, just furthers the loneliness that you have as an adult, because then you feel like, oh, well, I don't necessarily need a family, so I'm not going to worry about spending my time trying to create one with anyone. But yet I'm wondering why it is that I'm sitting here so lonely. And you can have roommates, sure. Like I said earlier, you can have cats and dogs and this sort of thing. But when we talk a little bit more about the types of connections that you have in a relationship like that, a deeply committed traditional, marriage or engagement or what have you, it is a different ballgame entirely. Because as I said, you can be in a room with people and be in a social situation and still feel alone. But anyways, the children are raised to understand that, like, this is, for lack of a better term, your purpose in life. But it's not in a lack of empowerment type of thing. It's not in a well, you can't do the alternative. And I certainly don't advocate for that either. I mean, I think your choice is your choice as far as what you do in your life. But I'm just saying that in my experience, as I've gotten older and as I've tried to stick to more of these, I guess, modern norms in society, is that it just made me increasingly lonely until I, met my traditional significant other. And I think raising your children, again, with that mindset is very important, because then they grow up understanding, okay, this is what I need to do. And then you can teach them how to do that. And you can have a type of traditional marriage, which then allows you to model what they should come to expect. And that's another issue in and of itself that I could spend a whole episode talking about, but it's children's flawed notions of what a marriage or a relationship or, whatever should be. And why that's important is because, the last couple of generations, like my generation, Gen Z, and even the Gen Xers, who are now the adults that are raising children, were they themselves raised in an environment where those relationships weren't modeled properly. And we've now started this culture of, oh, well, it's okay to get divorced, and it's okay if you, have to have a custody battle over your kids, and this, that, and the other. It's become very normal. But I think being in a household where it's raised that, no, when two people get married, they stick together. They make vows, and they figure out how to make things work as a team, is really important to instill these kinds of values in the coming generation. And as I said, I think the Amish community does a wonderful, terrific job of this. From as much as I've been able to learn of them through having those connections with, friends, family, and that sort of thing. All of that being said, just some food for thought. And I will leave you to think about how your life might be different if there was someone in it who you knew wasn't going anywhere, and then all they asked was that you do a certain job based on what's more natural to you. And I think once we start to understand that our job is not to figure out who's more superior, but to just enlist the capabilities of each person in the household and use those to the best of their ability, I think we can break down some of these barriers between men and women. I think we can break down some of these barriers between partners of any kind. And we can make it a lot easier to build those traditional types of homes that do leave you more fulfilled and give you a better sense of community, especially when you spread that out to your neighbors and so forth. So think about how perhaps your sense of loneliness might be different, or how your life in general might be different if you had a partner like that. If you knew how to get a partner like that, if you weren't afraid to go out and reach other people and talk to them and sort of build these relationships and courtships with each other. Just something to chew on. I've been your host, Austin Newton. This has been the Retro Renaissance Podcast.